Good morning. There isn't a lot of time, so I'll make a quick start and try to keep time. I want to speak under this title, Trying to Be at Home in the World, Education for the Present. And I'm just really honored to have received the invitation to speak here on this very special day and this very special point in time for Steiner world of education. There are a couple of things I would like to share with you, and of course there's always more. I'd like to point at what I think is the unique insight of Steiner world of education, where I think it brings something to this bigger tradition of progressive education that I think is unique and that should not be forgotten. That is connected to a rather unique practice that I want to mention. I want to say that it's a real challenge not to forget this uniqueness in our world today. And I think that it remains important to claim or reclaim a space for that insight and that work. I come originally from the Netherlands, where Steiner Waldorf schools are called free schools. And I think freedom partly means to gain the freedom to do your own thing, and that was important work in the first 100 years. I think in the second 100 years, I also want to make a case for saying there is now a need to share this freely with the rest of the world and the future to come. That's basically the agenda, and in 40 minutes I would just say, fasten your seatbelts and let's see how far we can go. There is the question what education is actually for. And when you begin to look at that over history, it's interesting to see very different answers at different points in time. In ancient Greek, you can say one strong motive was to say education is about giving free men, and only the men with time and resources, even more time and more resources to become more perfect, an aristocratic notion of education. An important thing happened in the Reformation that I think we shouldn't forget in our European history, that suddenly the Bible became a book that everyone was allowed to read, which then raises the educational question, how can we make sure that everyone can read? The question of literacy, you might say, in contemporary times. In the Enlightenment, around the European revolutions that were mentioned, again a different motive emerges. You can say the motive to think freely, to think responsibly, to think for yourself, and also to have the courage to do that. In the late 19th century, still another motive emerges, that education should actually be something for everyone, not a matter of wealth, not a matter of gender, not a matter of social class. And then we find ourselves in 2019, and when we look around at the discourses on education, we see very different ones. We see countries obsessed by wanting to score high in PISA, countries that want to become as good as Finland, and you can probably add things to that. Now, when I sent my PowerPoint, there were all kind of interesting clicks, so a lot of surprises, but I think that was lost in putting it in this, so you'll just get everything in one go. When I look at discussions about education nowadays, I often wondered, has education lost a plot? Have we lost a plot? What is happening? An obsession in many countries with test scores, measurement, league table positions. And I think those developments, although I understand where they're coming from, and they often come out of good intentions, partly these historical intentions, at the same time lack something. They give me a feeling that there is also something not right with contemporary education. Now, of course, what we could do is say, let's get back to what education is for. But the answer to that question is not a universal answer. That is historically contingent, as philosophers would call it. At each point in history, we again need to ask this question, So what is education? What do we do in this meeting between the old and the new generation? So how we see the task of education is not just a matter of looking at the future. It is also a matter of understanding our past and seeing with which parts of that past, that history, we wish to connect, or even more urgent, which parts of that history we should connect with. That raises the interesting question what relevant, you could say, historical markers for our time are. And you probably all have views and opinions about that. But I want to share one important point with you that I think also runs straight through the history of Steiner education. There is a brilliant essay with a brilliant title by Theodor Adorno, based on a radio interview he gave in 1966. And the title of the essay is Education After Auschwitz. And he starts with a very simple but profound claim. Die Forderung, dass Auschwitz nicht noch einmal sei, ist die allererste an Erziehung. The first demand upon education is that Auschwitz will not happen again. And he makes this point 20 years after the end of the Second World War. And when you look at the rest of the text, he says, this is actually so obvious that it's remarkable that we should even mention it. But here you can say he gives a very strong historical marker. But he is not the only author who makes that reference. And whereas Adorno says this should not happen again, and that's the first duty upon education, Primo Levi, with a text that's now at the entrance of the Holocaust Monument in Berlin, puts a slightly different spin on it and says we shouldn't forget that Auschwitz has happened and that therefore it can happen again. We carry this horrible possibility inside our own humanity. That brings us directly, you could say, to the question of human freedom, which I think is the central theme also of Steiner Waldorf education. We can call it the issue of human freedom, the task of human freedom, the riddle of human freedom, and perhaps even the mystery of human freedom. Because we do not really understand it, and yet every morning when we wake up, we encounter this mystery in its full presence. Now here you can say that Steiner Waldorf education does stand in a broader and older tradition. In education you can say the question of human freedom is a modern concern that indeed comes into view around the European revolutions, end of the 18th century. And one author who I think brings this to the heart of the question of education is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in his book Émile points out that for educators there is a double task. Most people know Émile if they have read a book, but even many of my colleagues in education have never read a book, that's fine. They all know the first sentence that everything that sort of comes from the creator is fine, and when it ends up in society it all goes wrong. That seems to suggest that Rousseau is saying the main task of education is to keep all these societal influences away from the child. And there is a motive that we recognize in thinking about education, that we need to create space and time, you could say, for children to develop. But that's not Rousseau's point, because just as he says education has the duty to shield the child from too strong influences from the outside, he also says education has work to do to make sure that children are not overtaken by everything that comes from the inside. He calls that the passions. And the reason for this is that he said, in the middle between what pulls and pushes from the outside and what pulls and pushes from the inside, there is our human ability and task to, you could say, achieve sovereignty, to be able to stand up in the middle of all those forces. And that is where Rousseau puts the task of education. And I think when you see what he's trying to sketch there, it's still highly appropriate today. The question is, what is the status of this issue of human freedom, and how is it a concern for education? How can we work with this question in education? And this, of course, raises another question. Does education actually make a difference? I'm sure that all the people in the room would say, yes, of course, everything we try to do every day in our schools and in our universities and colleges of education, that makes a difference. That's really important. But when we look honestly at that question, you can say we are part of something else, because we all know that as human beings, we are natural beings, biological beings, so there is a lot of that comes into the mix. We know that there are all kind of other influences from the outside world that also influence and shape who we are. So what is this component where we can do educational work? This is actually a question that was asked very nicely in a book by a German education professor, Dietrich Benner, and he poses the question in this way. What's the contribution of nature, of nurture, and education? Now, if you believe sort of in justice, you would say it should be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Yeah, it's equal part. But we know the universe is not just. And when you begin to look at these questions, I think particularly nowadays, you see that some people are claiming a bigger and bigger and bigger share, particularly for the nature. They say it's all genetic, 98%, someone has claimed it's genetic. Then a lot of influences from the outside. So this space for education becomes a bit smaller, you could say. So what is that space? Now, before I show you Benner's answer, I want to bring that in a context, looking at two events. You may recognize this lady. This is Rosa Parks, who in 1954, if I remember it correctly, boarded a bus in Lincoln, Alabama. And in the bus there were clear signs, white forward, colored rear. Remarkably, I found this on eBay, so you can still buy these signs actually. Something strange happens there, because you can say there is a very clear message here, but Rosa Parks, as you probably know, didn't respond to that message. So if you think that education is about literacy, then you can say something really went wrong with the education of Rosa Parks, because there is a clear message and she is unable to decode what went wrong. Here is another historical example. This is Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for the logistics of moving people to concentration camps, fled to South America, and then was caught by the Israeli Secret Service and put on trial in Jerusalem. And what is interesting about Eichmann's case is that when he was asked whether he had responsibility very specifically for the death of everyone who perished in the concentration camps, his answer was that he said, no, I don't have responsibility for that because I was only doing my job. I was only following orders. So here you can say, if the job of education is to make sure that students do what we tell them to do, this is educational success. Adolf Eichmann learned to listen well, and you can ask, maybe he learned to listen too well. So what is happening here? It comes into perspective when Benner formulates his remarkable answer to the question, what is the contribution of these three, nature, nurture, and education? And he says, actually, nature and nurture together are always 100%. First time I read it, I just couldn't process it. And then I thought, this is strange, because here's one of the most important professors of education in Germany, and it looks like he throws education away. Actually, he doesn't. He brings education to the place where I think it belongs. And this is maybe the first point I'm trying to make here. He says, education is not concerned with all these influences that make us at this point in time who we are. Education is interested in a very different question. The question how out of all that an I can step forward. And you can say that's the question of freedom and sovereignty. And that question, Benner reminds us, is a question of a very different order. And these two orders cannot simply be collapsed onto each other. So he says that the work of education is not about this question which natural and social factors determine how we become who we are. It's a real question, we cannot deny that, but it's not where our focus as educators should be. He comes with a very nice German phrase, actually coming from Fichte, where he says what we do as educators is in all kind of ways the Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, difficult to translate, summoning to self-action, which is not that we say to our students, be yourself, but that we say, be a self, be an I. That, I think, is at the heart of the work of education, if it understands that it stands in a history where freedom matters. So Benner's book is 400 pages of German. I sort of lost the plot halfway because this is really hard stuff. But if you want to go to the core of what it is, it's actually very simple. What we do here in education is that we constantly knock on the door of our students and we ask, is anyone there? And that's the most simple but also the most difficult question for all of us to engage with. That, you can say, is the work of education. This means that the educational question is an existential question, not in French existentialism, but in the literal sense, it is the question about how we exist, how we try to live our lives. So this is not the question of identity, which is very popular in many educational discourses. You can say that's the question of who we are, which can be a very important question. But there is always another question coming after that question. Even if we manage to find out who we are, I'm still not there, I have to confess. There is the other question, how we are, how we try to live our lives, how we try to exist. And we cannot say that we will postpone the answer to that question until we have figured out who we are, because then we will never really engage with this question. So the question of our human existence is the question of what we will do with who we have become, what we will do with our identity, with what we will do with everything we have learned, with our capacities and competencies. But the problem is, we are never in a perfect state, and still we are called upon to do things. So our existence as human beings also means that we have to be in relationship with our inabilities, our blind spots, our incompetencies. So if we're going to talk about competencies later today, don't forget that incompetencies also matter in how we try to live our lives. There we need a different word, and some languages are more helpful than others. In English, I end up with this strange word, subjectness. Existing as subject, not as object. That is at stake. So if you want to put that on a t-shirt, it looks like this. The educational question is the question of the I. But I realized if you put that on a t-shirt, you end up with something really strange at the bottom of that. So not good. But what is this about? Very nicely, a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, Annemiek Zwart, was in a school with young children, and they were talking the popular language of policymakers that say, oh, we need to focus on learning outcomes, and we need to measure learning outcomes, and the whole thing. And then suddenly there was one boy who picked this up and said, wait a minute, the outcome, that's me. And I think he got more of what education is about than everything that was happening around him. So the education question is the question of the I, but never the I for itself or on itself, but the I in the world. Because the world is the place where we can exist. That's why I like to emphasize that for me, education can never be child-centered or curriculum-centered. And actually you see that discussion going on and on and on, and it never resolves itself. Education needs to be world-centered. It needs to bring child and curriculum together in order to try to make that step into the world. That may be a question of becoming knowledgeable, becoming competent, but it ultimately requires courage. So at the bottom of what we do, we are, I think, constantly in the process of trying to encourage children to try to be in the world and to try to be at home there. And this beautiful phrase comes from Hannah Arendt. And we all know, and I think that's really interesting, that at this point in time, the younger generation is speaking back to us and is asking where our courage is of trying to be at home in the world. And I think that is tremendously significant. Here I think I would put some of the unique insights of Steiner Waldorf education. And this is my way of formulating it, and you can do with it what you want. I think that what is a unique insight from Steiner Waldorf education is that the child is not a thing to begin with, but I would also say that the child is not a developing thing where the work of education is just to manage that development. For me, that is a problematic way of thinking about education that is very prominent in how people currently think about education. And then people say, well, if we understand how the brain works, for example, then we can manage this development. Or if we tell students that they should self-regulate, then they become managers of their own development. And all of that constantly turns the self of the child into a thing that needs to be managed. That's my worry there. The unique insight of Steiner Waldorf education is that education is about to question how the I can arrive in the world. Yeah, pulling the soul into the body is already quite something if you can pull it off, but that's only step one. Step two is how that embodied soul can enter the world. Because the world is the only place, space where we as human beings can live our life, are allowed to live our lives, are given the gift of living our lives. So it's a tremendously important place and space. And the whole point about living one's life is that we each can only live our own life. I would say, therefore, but this is probably a discussion point, that the unique insight of Steiner Waldorf education is that they don't have a developmental perspective on education, but a biographical perspective. And there is a huge difference between the two. And it's not the words that matter, but it's the difference that I really want to put to your attention. When you see that point, and you look back at what happens in Steiner schools, you encounter a unique educational practice. But it's really important to look carefully, because that practice can also look very differently if you just say it's a lovely building or they do all kind of arty things. That is not what is happening in those buildings. They do biographical existential work, I would say. You all know the practice, so I don't need to tell you about it, but I'm just saying, look very carefully about what you're doing. Steiner world of education is also very simple, and that makes it such an easy job. It is simple in its principles, because if you ask me what lies at the basis of that beautiful, complicated educational work, there are two principles: incarnation and freedom. What does incarnation mean? Literally, it means coming into the flesh, but then, as I've said, the flesh needs to get into the world. So the first task is this world-centeredness, to help the next generation to take that step into the world and have the courage to try to be there. But this world, and maybe our world more than previously, is a world that pushes and pulls, that seduces and puts all kind of very problematic incentives in front of all us. So you can say, in addition to the task of incarnation, getting there, there is the task, how do you remain free in that complex existence? And I would say that is the question of achieving sovereignty. And that's not something we can tick off at the age of 18 or when we get a diploma. That is a lifelong challenge. Philippe Mérieux, a brilliant French educational scholar, also points at this double dynamics. The work of education is to engage and to liberate, to connect and then to find freedom in that connection. That has nothing to do with all the educational research that is looking for what are effective interventions to produce measurable learning outcomes. This is risky work, and I've suggested this risk is fundamentally beautiful because it has something to do with how we as human beings can appear in this world. And if you get what I'm trying to say, this is risky work because the I is not a thing that can be produced through interventions. Ultimately, the I is the work of the self. And the best we can do with our students is to encourage them not to forget that they carry that fantastic possibility inside themselves. For me, this works much more at the level of desire. So I've tried to put it in language by saying what we're trying to do there is to arouse a desire or keep a desire alive for wanting to exist in the world as subject. Now we're talking about an educational idea that is 100 years old and comes out of an even older history. So some people might say, come on, Steiner education, you've become old-fashioned, you need to update and upgrade. Isn't it time we bring Steiner world of education up to date? Yeah, connected to all these, let's put it like that, seductive discourses like we should give our students 21st century skills for survival in an unknown future. We should make sure they achieve high in order to contribute to the knowledge economy. So what then with knitting, gardening, and eurythmy? Or maybe you could say our time actually is in urgent need of this, not because it is about the skill of knitting, but because knitting has biographical significance. Now that, and that's my third and last point, has to do with how we, from where we are, look around us and look at our time. The phrase that Ilona used, that I've used somewhere, is indeed to characterize our time as a time of shopping, and that is a quick way to pick up on an idea from a really interesting book by an American author, Paul Roberts, who says, if I try to capture what our time is, I would call the society we have created with ourselves an impulse society. In the American version of the book, the subtitle is America in the Age of Instant Gratification. And I think that the precedent they have chosen exemplifies this problem really well. In the English edition, the subtitle is "What is wrong with getting what we want?" And what Roberts does really well in the book is to show what is wrong if that becomes the organizing principle of our collective lives. It has a lot to do with this difference between what we want and what we need. And Roberts comes with interesting statistics that he says, when I look at the American economy, 70% of what is produced is stuff we don't need. It's stuff we think we need, but we actually don't need it. So he says, what do we actually do with an economic system that is almost too good at giving us what we want? Yeah, we know the problems with obesity, addiction, they work precisely there. He also says this economy that we have, that is so focused on giving us what we want, is maybe no longer able to help us in giving us what we need. And we know that that is one of the big problems of the current financial system. The big question is, of course, where do our wants come from? And that is an existential question. But this is one analysis that actually economic forces have played a very important role in pushing up our wants. This has something to do with the strange idea that people think that economies can only exist if they continue to grow. For a long time, we have pursued this growth by constantly opening up new markets, and some countries here in the room have been very good at that and have benefited a lot from getting stuff from elsewhere or selling stuff elsewhere. At the point when the economy becomes global, suddenly it's not possible to grow there. Then you see that the economy tries to make money out of time. The stock market, as long as your computer is just slightly faster than the computer at another stock market, you can make money out of that difference. But at some point, everything comes so fast that you cannot make money out of time. That is my analysis of the recent stock market crash. Time was up, you could say. And then what you see emerging, and again, Roberts documents that really well, he says, where is there still capacity for growth? And he says, that is if the economy can give us new desires. And this company is the best example of it. Apple doesn't sell mobile phones. Apple sells us the desire for a new mobile phone. And they sell us that for free, so that's really kind. But of course, once that desire is inside us, then the money begins to flow. And there you can say we have created an economic system, and Roberts also shows that this has become the logic of the political system, where we have infinite desires and are constantly being told you should desire more. Roberts is not saying this is new. We know as human beings that desire is part of what we are. But he says what is new is the scale, that we have a society based on the logic of impulse, immediate, instant gratification. And the other thing, and I think that's really important for education, and I'm going to end with an observation about that, is that many of the institutions we had where we helped each other to temper our desires, to look carefully at what should be desired and what should not be desired, those institutions have themselves become part of the logic of desire. That's what I see in contemporary education when we're being told our schools cannot be good enough, they should be excellent, we should be number one, we should compete with other countries, rather than to say, is that a desirable orientation? And I think it's not, because it's of course not sustainable. It's a rat race that even you won't wish that rats should be involved in. So this pressure constantly to improve rather than to ask what needs to be done here and now, what is the challenge before us, what does history ask from us, that begins to disappear. So the one question that in a sense has become taboo in this impulse society is precisely this question, is everything that we we think we want? Is that what we actually need? And therefore, as educators, we should be very worried about this dynamics, because this means that the impulse society is not interested in the arrival of the I. The impulse society just wants us to run behind our desires. And the impulse society is rapidly maybe eroding the institutions, the places, the practices where we can slow down and sit together and look carefully at all these dynamics from the outside, from the inside. And with Apple, you see that looks outside is also inside. So this is a very strange mix, where this question of how do we achieve sovereignty again becomes a really urgent question. Here I want to make a case for the school, not as a place for learning. If that's our only answer to why do we have schools, then we can close the schools because you can learn much better and faster on the internet. And if we give Google the power, they will be happy to organize that for us. There is if you go back to the Greek root meaning of school, school interestingly actually means free space and free time. Time not yet determined by societal demands. Now, there is, of course, the scandal in Greek society that free time was only available to wealthy men, and that's where we are in a slightly different position now. But the idea of the school, not as a place where we should work hard to become competent and achieve all kinds of things, but school actually as the time we set free, the time we give to the next generation, precisely to work on this question of sovereignty, where you can meet the world, where you can meet yourself in relation to the world and work through that complexity. That, you can say, is an urgent reason why we need the school. But this kind of school, the school that understands that the educational question is biographical and existential. The school, you can say, is the place where we can try, fail, try again, and after that, the beautiful insight from Samuel Beckett, the only thing we can hope for is that we will fail better. But never put perfection at the end of the educational trajectory, because perfection, as we know from history, is a dangerous ambition. So that's what I wanted to share with you. The observation that, of course, you know, and time is running out, we live in impatient times where society constantly asks more from the school. And it often does that because it hopes that the school can solve the problems of society. And that's already a problem. Yeah, the problem of the workforce, the problem of citizenship, the problem of European democracy, the problem of social cohesion, it's all constantly pushed over the fence of the school. And then they say, school, if you can solve it for us, then we're fine. That's the logic that is strong in policy, where the question is constantly, what kind of school do we as society need? But particularly in those impatient times, we need to set time free. We need to emancipate time, you could literally say. And we need to claim space to help each other, and particularly the new generation. But as I said before, the question, who actually needs the help, encouragement? And the encouragement is really shifting. To keep coming back to how are we able to stand upright in that very rapid flux, achieving sovereignty. And what I value about Steiner Waldorf education, for many years against the grain rather than in the mainstream, that it keeps claiming that free space and continues to practice education with a connection to this existential question, human freedom in the world. That's why, for me, it's completely obvious that Steiner Waldorf education responds to the challenge for education after Auschwitz. So I see that historical line, and I think that's a really important response. It is not there, as I said, just for Steiner Waldorf education to be happy amongst ourselves, but here is something that needs sharing, that needs communicating. For that, it remains important that we keep working on what is the right language to articulate what's happening there, and that is tremendously difficult. Because otherwise there may be the risk, you could say, that Steiner Waldorf education gets lost in translation. So also here there is a difficult challenge how to remain sovereignty without withdrawing from the world. For that important work, a different question comes into view. Not this impatient question, what kind of school does society need? But the question, what kind of society does the school actually need so that it can continue to be a school? And that question goes, as you see, completely in the opposite direction and is an important question to keep reminding policymakers about. So that this school can be this place where we can help each other to remain courageous in this difficult task of living on this earth together well. Good luck with that task, and thanks very much for your attention.